All right. I had something happen this week that has not yet happened in my pastoral ministry. I often put the preaching schedule together, 3 to 6 months in advance, and I sort of list out what passages we're going to go over on what dates, and I sort of put it all together. And as you can see, what happened, March 24th goes right to April 7th. I have no March 31st even on there at all. And so last week I had decided I was going to preach either Daniel 4 or Daniel 5. So guess what? We're going to do Daniel 5 after all. That week just didn't exist. I don't know how that happened, but it turns out God wanted us to be in Daniel 5. And actually it's quite interesting because Daniel 4 and Daniel 5 actually communicate really the same message, but from two different perspectives, which is why I was going to just do one of them. But sometimes hearing the same message from two different angles is actually important and is needed. We're trying to do this with our kids at this moment, actually. Teach the same thing from two different angles. We're trying to really get them to focus on, with one another, building each other up and not tearing each other down. And so one of the ways we're coming at that is every time we hear them encouraging each other, we are like all over that, and we're championing that, and we're giving them high fives. In fact, we even started yesterday this thing of putting a marble in a jar. Every time you build each other up, you get to put this marble in this jar, and if we fill it up, we're going to do something fun as a family. So one of the ways we're going at it is from the positive side, encouraging when they do it right. But the other side is when they tear each other down, is we also deal with that. And there's consequences when they tear each other down. When they make poor choices. And so depending on the severity of the comment that they make, the severity of the consequence also changes. So in trying to change their behavior of how they communicate to each other, you can come at it from two different sides. That's a little bit of what Daniel's doing in chapters 4 and 5. Daniel 4, in a sentence, what we looked at last week, is that the repentant reap the rewards of grace no matter how bleak their pasts. And I hope all of us just breathe a sigh of relief and say, amen, thank God, this is the gospel in the Old Testament, that no matter what's in our pasts, there's grace in our God. We run to him humbly, and we fall at his feet, and we say we don't deserve it, but you give it to us. And that's what we saw in Nebuchadnezzar's life. God completely pardons the humble who look to him. That was Nebuchadnezzar's story. Daniel chapter 5 could be summed up in this sentence, that the rebellious reap the consequences of wrath, however secure their positions. And so in this chapter, we're going to get a flesh and blood example of this lived out. In chapter 4, we saw how God pardons the humble. Here we're going to see God's sure judgment of the proud. So that's what's happening in these two chapters. And the verse that links these two chapters is the very last verse of chapter 4, verse 37. Here it is. It says, this Nebuchadnezzar talking at the end of his sort of conversion experience. He says, now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride he is able to humble. And the fleshing out of that last sentence is really what chapter 5 is. How God is able to humble those who are prideful. And so let's get into it. Open up to Daniel 5 with me. We're going to sort of work our way through the story and comment on some of the important aspects as we get to them. And then we're going to sort of pull out two ideas. After getting through chapter 5, what do we see about God in this passage? And then what do we see about our response based to what's been revealed? What should be our response? So let's get into Daniel chapter 5. We'll start in verse 1. King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. So we have to stop right away because last chapter we were talking about Nebuchadnezzar, and now we're talking about this other king, King Belshazzar. Well, without telling us, Daniel has fast-forwarded 30 years. And Belshazzar isn't even the next king. There's been a string of 5 kings in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and in kind of quick succession. Belshazzar is actually co-king with his father at the same time. An interesting historical effect. Critics of the Bible for a long time used to take sort of offense here and say there is no record of any ancient king of Babylon named Belshazzar. So the Bible's just sort of making up these stories. They didn't really exist in history. And for a long time, that's sort of what the critics thought. In 1850, this cylinder was found. It's called the Cylinder of Nabonidus. And Nabonidus was one of the kings of Babylon. And on this cylinder, what it says, can you read it? No. What it says is that Nabonidus had a son named Belshazzar. And for a time, Nabonidus had to leave Babylon and go to the Arabian Peninsula. And while he was gone, he left his son king in Babylon. And his son was named Belshazzar. So it sort of stopped the critics where they were and put more validity in the scriptures. And I love when stuff like this comes out, when archaeology confirms what the Bible says is true. And in a way, he wasn't a king in Israel. In another way, he was for this period of time. So here's Belshazzar throwing this blowout party. It says 1,000 of his nobles were there. 1,000 is just a round number for a whole lot of people. All of the upper class, the aristocracy of Babylon were there at this huge party, drinking wine with him. Verse 2. Belshazzar was drinking his wine. He gave orders, while he was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Now this might seem like a sort of tame thing compared to the drunken exploits of others. But make no mistake, this was a very foolhardy plan. The king had lost all sense of decency at this point. To use holy things in this way, even the holy things from another religion, was considered in the Oriental sort of worldview a sacrilege. This was a misuse. This was something you didn't do. It was a violation. These gold and silver goblets were from the temple in Jerusalem. They were dedicated to the God of Israel. And so King Nebuchadnezzar, in doing this, is trying to mock the God of Israel. We learned earlier in Daniel, 70 years earlier, Nebuchadnezzar, in attacking Jerusalem, took all of these goblets. And in Ezra, it tells us there's 5,400 of them. So this is a lot. They're all brought, and Nebuchadnezzar puts them in the temples of his gods, as if to make the point the Babylonian gods are stronger than the God of Israel. And if that wasn't bad enough, now Belshazzar wants to take it one step further. He wants to demonstrate to his nobles, to his wives, his concubines, that Israel's God is so insignificant, they're going to take these goblets and drink from them. They're going to trample on the honor of Israel's God. They're going to spit in his face, and they're going to get away with it. The Babylonian ruling class, en masse, is going to disgrace Israel's God. That's the plan. And as you're reading it, you're saying, okay, hopefully someone in this party is sober enough to put a stop to this. Because they're playing with fire, but nobody is. The Babylonians just sort of go along with it. Verse 3. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And to underscore sort of the gravity of this, the narrator puts they were taken from the temple of God, from God's house. They belong to the Most High God. And so this is a challenge. This is challenging the God of Israel. They're treating him with contempt. Now, to make matters even worse, it's bad enough to touch them. It's bad enough to drink from them. They take it one step further. Verse 4, as they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver and bronze and iron and wood and stone. Now, notice that these gods, they're not named here. In fact, not only are they not named, but what is named is what they're made of. And he does this again later in the chapter. He's making the point there's no life in these gods. While mocking the living God, the Babylonians are praising their lifeless gods. They commit an act of arrogant defiance against the Most High, and they're challenging him to avenge his own honor. One of the ways to sort of study the Bible, whether it's narrative passage like this or some other part, is as you go through, just sort of make up your own heading for that section. Sometimes there's headings in there already. Don't use those. Make up your own. Put them in your own words. Try to describe what's happening. So as I went through this, I sort of made some different headings, and I'll share them with you as we went through. I came up with, I think, 7 different headings. But the heading for these 4 verses is the gauntlet is thrown down. I mean, they are challenging the God of Israel. And it's easy for us not to make much of this. I mean, big deal, drinking wine from some goblets. But that's because really we don't have anything that's sacred anymore. But this is a challenge. How is God going to respond? What's he going to do when his honor is trampled upon? Remember the story of King David when he's bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem? They put it on this cart, and at one point, one of the oxen gets sort of startled, and the ark looks like it's about to fall off the cart. And one of the priests, Uzzah is his name, he goes to sort of steady the Ark of the Covenant so it won't fall. You remember what happens? It says the anger of the Lord was kindled against him, and the Lord struck him dead on the spot. Now, if that's how God responds when one of his own people touches one of the holy things, how is God going to respond when this pagan Gentile nation who's living in complete rebellion to him touches these holy things? And the answer is not very long in coming. The next section, I gave the heading, the powerful effect of God's little finger. Verse 5. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. So the challenge is thrown out, and immediately something happens. This dismembered hand shows up, and nobody wants a dismembered hand. It starts writing on the wall near the lampstand, which just meant everyone could see it. And the king knows this is not good news right away, and he is deeply affected. Look at verse 6. His face turned pale, which is saying something for a darker-skinned Middle Eastern man. His face turned pale. He was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees knocked together. I thought this was interesting. That last phrase, his knees knocked together, really it says the knots of his loins were loosened, which some commentators think he soiled himself. Here he is in front of this enormous crowd, all his nobles, his wives, his concubines, and talk about striking a pose. He is totally humiliated. I mean, he is frightened. This big shot king, who's head of the whole known world, challenging the God of Israel. And all it takes is these little fingers. And he's undone. It shakes him emotionally, it shakes him physically to the core. I mean, what a juxtaposition. Now, the king can't read these words, but he knows that they must mean bad news. So here's what he does next. Verse 7. The king summoned, now, we've seen these guys get summoned sort of every chapter so far. And I kind of think if you were making this into a movie, there'd be like a theme song, for whenever these guys come, like da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Like that theme song would play every time they call these guys, because here they come. The king summoned the enchanters, the astrologers, the diviners. Then he said to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. Well, now we know why 3rd highest, right? Because his dad's first, he's second, and this is 3rd. Verse 8. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. Now, it's not that this was necessarily written in a different language. But ancient Aramaic, like ancient Hebrew, it was often written, or it was only written with consonants. The vowels weren't put in until 600 years after Jesus, actually. So it's just consonants, and oftentimes they're all put together. There's no spaces. So first you have to figure out where do the spaces come between the consonants, and then what vowels do you use to make what words. I'll give you an example. Go to the next one. So here's an example in English. If you're going to read this riddle, first you have to figure out where to put the spaces in there to figure out what words those are. So say you decide, okay, after thinking through all the options, let's put the first space after the third letter. Okay, even after you do that, there's a lot of options of what that word could be. It could be pined, or pained, or pond, or pound, or panda. And there's others as well. And that's only the first word. There's at least 2 or 3 more words to go. And even after that, then you have to know the interpretation on top of that. So you could see why this is such a difficult riddle that the wise men of Babylon can't do it. They're perplexed. Verse 9. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew even more pale. Now, who knows what color he is now? I mean, now he's like translucent or something. His nobles were baffled. The next section I gave this heading: even big kings need to listen to their mothers. Because enter the queen. And you may have a footnote that says it's the queen mother. We're already told all his wives and concubines are there. And even on top of that, this queen comes marching into his presence and is going to give him counsel. One of his wives wouldn't have that kind of authority, but the queen mother had that kind of authority in ancient Babylon. Verse 10. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, or in other words, predecessor, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom is called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. Now, Daniel's probably in his 80s now, so he might be just sort of walking his dog and going fishing. I mean, who knows? It's been 23 years since Nebuchadnezzar died. So it could be that one of these 5 kings in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar sort of got rid of Daniel. Oftentimes when a new king would come, they'd get rid of all of that other king's wise men. Sort of a wholesale dismissal. We don't know where Daniel necessarily is. But the queen gives him quite an accommodation here. It says, go get Daniel. He'll help you. The next section, let's see. Skipping a part. Okay. So the king listens to his mother. The next heading I gave, no respect, despite his predicament. Listen to how the king addresses Daniel. Verse 13. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? Immediately, he's sort of wanting to put Daniel in his place. Oh, you're one of the riffraff that we sort of brought in after we conquered Judah. John Calvin says he interrogates Daniel as a captive. And in his next speech, you can see how he sort of doubts Daniel's ability. Listen to the next passage here. He says, I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you. Now, his mom said the spirit of the holy gods. He's not going to give him that. He says, the spirit of the gods is in you, that you have insight and intelligence, outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read the writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretation and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you'll be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you'll be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. Now Daniel's obviously very angry. He looks around and he sees these holy goblets from the temple in Jerusalem. And then he's also angry at the way he's being treated. And so the next section I gave the heading Straight Talk from Daniel. Verse 17. Then Daniel answers the king. And we don't see any of the niceties that Daniel uses in other chapters with the other kings. He says, you can keep your gifts for yourself. Give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Okay, so Daniel says, I don't need your purple jumpsuit. I have a couple purple jumpsuits in my closet I'm already not wearing. I don't need your gold chain. If I put another gold chain on, I'm going to look like an Italian, and I can't do that. And then the next thing Daniel does is he delays. He says, I can read the writing, and I can give you the interpretation. But first, we need to have a little history lesson. And so this is sort of a narrative technique. He says, I'm going to give you the interpretation. So we're all sort of on the edge of our seat. What is it? And yet he's going to take this detour to give us a very important history lesson. Verse 18. He says, Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. So whatever greatness Nebuchadnezzar had, Daniel says it's very clear who it came from. God gave that to him. It was all a gift from the Most High God. Because of his high position, God, gave him all the nations and peoples of every language. They dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. Those he wanted to humble, he humbled. Daniel's saying Nebuchadnezzar could do whatever he wanted. He could do as he pleased. He had absolute unrestrained power. But it was a gift from the Most High God. And as Daniel's about to remind Belshazzar, Nebuchadnezzar forgot that basic fact. Verse 20. But when Nebuchadnezzar's heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people, given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys, ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven. This is all chapter 4. Until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. And now Daniel's done with his history lesson. He says, after recalling Nebuchadnezzar's pride and God's punishment, now he looks directly at King Belshazzar and says, But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Daniel is saying, in effect, knowing how God humbled your predecessor because he was proud, you should have realized that you can't defiantly challenge the God of Israel, the Most High God. You should have humbled yourself. Instead, you did the opposite. Verse 23. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. Now, how did he do this? First, you had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles and your wives and your concubines drank from them. Second, you praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, which cannot see or understand. And third, you did not honor the God who holds in his hands your life and all your ways. I mean, what a contrast. On one hand, you have all these gods of gold and silver, all these metals, these gods who can't see, who can't hear, they don't understand. And on the other hand, you have the living God who holds your life in his hand. All he has to do is close his hand and your life is over. And you failed to honor the living God. I mean, what an indictment. And then finally, what the king's been waiting for. Then Daniel reads God's judgment. Verse 24. Therefore, he, God, sent the hand that wrote the inscription. The king kind of knew that. As soon as he challenged the king and saw the hand, he knew who the hand was from. Now Daniel tells him, God sent the hand that wrote this inscription. And this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. So Daniel, he reads this string of consonants that the wise men could not. And he comes up with 3 different words that each have to do with differing measuring weights for measuring precious metals. The first is mene, or mina, which is 500 grams. Daniel repeats it for emphasis. The second is the word tekel, which is or another word for shekel, about 10 grams. And then the third parsin is a half mina. You may have a footnote with this stuff in there. About 250 grams. So going back to our example from before, if that's what you were given, then the equivalent for this would be a pound, an ounce, and then a half pound. Now, this is not a very meaningful message. You know, even after Daniel says this to the king, it doesn't mean anything, right? So now Daniel's going to tell him what it means. And what Daniel looks at these three words and he interprets them as verbs, not as nouns. Daniel understands these to mean numbered, to mean weighed, and to mean divided. Verse 26, here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered your days of your reign and brought it to an end. And we still use that expression today. Your days are numbered. He's not just talking about his life, though. He's talking about the kingdom. Your reign, the days of your reign are numbered. And it's interesting. This is the very night when the Babylonian Empire will end. Verse 27, Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and been found wanting. God has weighed your life, and you are too light. God's demand for righteousness and justice, you don't measure up. And then verse 28, Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Again, the focus is on the kingdom, not just his life. God's going to take the kingdom away from Babylon and give it to the next kingdom. The next verse, I gave the heading, Belshazzar is a man of his word. And this kind of surprised me. Verse 29, then at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was given his purple jumpsuit, and a gold chain was placed around his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. I didn't really expect him to do that. I kind of expected Belshazzar just to say, take off his head just for the fun of it. But he's a man of his word. And then the next section I said, well, God keeps his word too. Verse 30. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain. And it doesn't exactly tell us how, but it's pretty clear. This is what's called the divine passive voice. It's clear God had him killed. Ancient sources tell us that for 2.5 years, the Medes and Persians encamped around Babylon. But we talked about Babylon last week. It had these walls that were 350 feet high, and they were 87 feet thick. I mean, Babylon was secure, and it was a big enough city they could grow crops from within the city. It had a river flowing through it. It was secure. In fact, no one in Babylon was even afraid, even though this army was encamped for 2.5 years around them, because they're throwing a party and getting drunk. They're not afraid at all. Well, as ancient sources tell us, what the Medes and Persians did to get into Babylon is they diverted the river into a marsh. And then in that dry riverbed, they went under the city walls, went into the palace, found Belshazzar, and killed him. It's interesting. The name Belshazzar means O Bel, which is the name of the highest Babylonian god, another name for him. It means, O Bel, protect the king. And yet, not even the highest Babylonian god could protect the king from the anger of Israel's God. Chapter 4 ended by saying the King of Heaven is able to bring low those who walk in pride. And Belshazzar was Babylon's last king. And then verse 31, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. And again, it doesn't say who gave the kingdom to Darius, but it's clear from Daniel, because the theme we keep seeing over and over again is God's the one who takes down kingdoms, raises them up, who gives them to whomever he pleases. So, that's Daniel chapter 5. So, what is revealed about God in this chapter? There's lots of things. It'd probably be worth just discussing that with others. But here's one, is that God has no rival, and that he is in control of human history. Imagine how comforting this would have been to the exiles of Israel who are living in Babylon. Year after year, king after king, they are living in oppression under this evil empire. And to them, it seems like nothing's ever going to change. And yet, here God, just like that, brings the Babylonian Empire to an end. I mean, Babylon thought they were untouchable. Their walls could not be penetrated. They were secure. So secure, they thought they could rival God. And all it took was God's little fingers writing on the wall, and they were undone. And already Nebuchadnezzar's dream from chapter 2. Remember the dream of all these successive kingdoms? The head of gold and then the chest of silver is going to be another kingdom. Already the dream is starting to come true. The Babylonian Empire, the head of gold, is gone. Now we're in the Medo-Persian Empire, the chest of silver. God is moving human history towards a culmination. And in that dream, the culmination is when a rock starts rolling down this mountain, a rock not cut from human hands, and it smashes all human kingdoms. And we know that Jesus is that rock. And Jesus initiated his kingdom when he was here on earth. Over and over again, Jesus proclaimed his kingdom. I love this verse, especially in light of this passage we looked at today. Jesus says, if I drive out demons by the finger of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. Jesus says, I'm starting a kingdom. It's starting. It's not fully here yet, but it's coming. And Jesus lived under the Roman Empire. He lived under the kingdom of the enemy of the age. But when we place our faith in Jesus, we enter into his kingdom, and we still look ahead to when he is going to finally set up his kingdom once and for all and deal with all these evil kingdoms. Look at this verse where the Apostle Paul sort of looks ahead. He says, but each in turn, Christ, the first fruits, talking about our resurrection, then when he comes, those who belong to him, all of the rest of us. And then listen, then the end will come when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. I was even thinking about this, James, when you were sharing about the evil that has occurred in your own country and what has happened there. And all of these evil human empires that exist, it's going to be over one day. Our hope is when Jesus is going to set up the kingdom that's going to last forever. That's like the paradise that was at the beginning. God is in control of human history. And sometimes I think we feel so far removed from what Jesus shared about what's coming. Or sometimes because of the brokenness we see around us, we live in fear of what's going to happen in the future. What's this world going to look like for our kids or for our grandkids? I mean, we live in a world with suicide bombers and terrorists and school shootings and political divide and unstable countries with powerful weapons. I mean, there's actually reason to be fearful. And yet the comfort is that God is in control of human history. God can tear down a wicked king. He can take a wicked empire and bring it to its end. And he's going to restore his perfect kingdom. That's what we hold on to. That God has no rival. I think that's what we see about God in this passage. The second question, well, what's our response to be in light of what's been revealed? And again, this is where chapter 4 and 5, I think, work together. You could summarize chapter 4 and 5 as God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. God opposes the proud, chapter 5. God gives grace to the humble, chapter 4. The walls of Babylon could not protect the king against God's judgment. No walls are high enough. No walls are strong enough to protect us from God's holy wrath. The only protection one can find from God's holy wrath is the refuge that God himself provides in his Son. And that's the reason Jesus didn't come to destroy all human kingdoms the first time he came. No, he came to destroy human sin on the cross, to become that refuge for us, to return to God. And that's even the reason why Jesus is delaying now. He's delaying now so more people can find refuge in him before he comes and brings everything to its rightful end. So God opposes the proud, gives grace to the humble. So I think our response is, are we going to choose the path of pride or the path of humility? I think that's our response. And that's a one-time decision when we place our faith in Christ. Placing our faith in Christ is the path of humility. Say, I need help. I can't do it. But then every day we have a choice of which path are we going to take. What does it look like to live in the path of humility? Well, it looks like every time you can, you own up to your own sin and you confess it. Humility, it looks like practicing gratitude. Because every time you admit to God how grateful you are for something, you're saying how in need you are. Choosing the path of humility is when you make life about other people and not about yourself. Our response to this passage is to say, oh man, God, make me humble. Don't let my heart get hard like chapter 5. Make me turn to you in humility like chapter 4. I think that's the powerful effect of these two chapters. And I can see we are ready to go. So you guys have been very patient. But let me pray for us as we end our service today. Our God is powerful. He's in control, so we humbly put ourselves before him.